just focus on behind the book, the Game of Thrones real history. And I'm Josh Flint, as Rhian has already said. So we're going to focus on the real life histories behind A Song of Ice and Fire, or A Game of Thrones, which is a fantasy book and TV series. It's set in the medieval world of Westeros, the fictional medieval world of Westeros. But inspiration for all of these events come from historical events. And we're going to break down some of these in this talk. So first, we're going to talk about and describe events from the book series. And then we're going to explore the historical inspirations for these events. And then we're going to show a couple of really great items from the Leeds Libraries collections about these historical events. But I'm just going to say, beware, there will be spoilers for the Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire book series and TV series. So if you don't want to know any of the spoilers, maybe put me on mute. I'm not entirely sure what you can do. But yes, there will be spoilers. I'm just going to put that out there. So where else can you start? But we're going to focus on the Starks during the War of the Five Kings. And we're going to look at the real historical inspirations behind the War of the Five Kings. And we're going to just focus on how the Starks fared during the War of the Five Kings. So where else can you start but the very beginning? And we're going to start with the Stark and Lannister feud that really kicks off the War of the Five Kings. So I believe there's a power vacuum that's left by the kingly absence of King Robert Baratheon, who keeps asking others to rule for him as Hand of the King. He doesn't want to rule. He doesn't want to get bogged down by the everyday duties of ruling. And so because he keeps on asking people to be Hand of the King, this creates a distrust between Robert's Hand of the King, Eddard Stark, and Robert's Queen, Cersei Lannister. And these problems and this split between the houses of Stark and Lannister only get worse after the death of King Robert. And this intrigue and corruption and treachery at the court results in the treason and execution of Eddard Stark, leading to the beginning of the War of the Five Kings. Now, I think this is completely based off the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. So the Wars of the Roses started in 1455 and ended in 1487. But the War of the Roses really started because Henry VI, who was king at the start of the Wars of the Roses, had a complete mental breakdown in 1453, and it was in a catatonic state for a whole year. So for a whole year, he didn't speak to anyone. He couldn't rule. And this creates a power vacuum of what happens when the king cannot fulfill the kingly duties of ruling the country. And who fills that power vacuum? Now, Margaret of Anjou, who was Henry VI's wife and queen, wanted to take over the country and become protector, but so did Henry VI's cousin, Richard, Duke of York. And both of these two were vying to become protector of England until Henry VI recovers. This creates a split in the nobility, because people who favoured Margaret of Anjou were called the Lancastrians, and people who favoured Richard, Duke of York were called the Yorkists, leading to the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. Eventually, York wins more public support and becomes protector of England. And as soon as York becomes protector, Henry VI miraculously recovers in 1454, strips York of all of his powers, and this cements the divisions in England. And then because York has been stripped of his new powers, he rebels, and this is the start of the Wars of the Roses. And so I think there's so many parallels between the start of the War of the Five Kings and the power vacuum that's left behind from Robert Baratheon, and the power vacuum that's left when Henry VI is unable to govern at the start of the Wars of the Roses. And one other similarity between the Wars of the Roses and the War of the Five Kings is that during the Wars of the Roses, there was 5 different kings of England. And obviously in Game of Thrones, the War of the Five Kings is because there's 5 kings vying for the crown. Now we have loads of really nice items of stock about the War of the Roses in the Leeds Libraries collection. So I've just chosen a couple really, or 3. And the first one is the union of 2 noble and illustrious families of Lancaster and York by Edward Hall, and he was writing in 1550, so about 100 years after the War of the Roses. And this is a really great chronicle about how the War of the Roses is represented 100 years after the events happened. And then we have a Chronicle of the Kings of England by Sir Richard Baker, and the one that we have in the Central Library is from 1679. And what Richard Baker has done is he's compiled lots of different authors who have written about different kings, and one of these kings is Henry VI, obviously. And there's a really great article within this book, within this chronicle, about how Henry VI's inability to govern creates the instability that starts the Wars of the Roses. And then finally, we have the Crowling Chronicle continuations, and this was written from 1459 to 1486. And so this is a contemporary account of what was happening during the Wars of the Roses. So any of these are excellent items about the War of the Roses in our Leeds Libraries collection. So our next part of this talk, we'll talk about the execution of Eddard Stark. So we've already looked at the power split between the Starks and the Lannisters. This will focus on the execution of Eddard Stark. So Eddard Stark is head of House Stark. After the death of King Robert Baratheon, Eddard is accused of treason after trying to stop Joffrey Baratheon from becoming king for a whole host of reasons, which I will not get into in this video. Eddard Stark pleads guilty to this treason order because he wants to save his daughters who have been captured. But the real problem with capturing and Eddard Stark being labelled and being found guilty of treason is that no one has any idea of what to do with him. So if you exile Eddard Stark, then people will rebel around him. If you execute Eddard Stark, then that's going to start new rebellions as well. So no one has any idea what's best to do. Is it best to keep him alive, or is it best to execute him? So in the end, they execute Eddard Stark, and this leads to the first Stark rebellion at the start of the War of the Five Kings. And I believe this is exactly the same as the problem that the parliamentarians had when they had during the execution of Charles I in 1649. So Charles I is defeated at the end of the English Civil War, and he's captured and he's put on trial for treason. And the parliamentarian court has no idea what to do with him. They don't want to execute Charles I because they see him as an anointed king, which means that the only person who's above him as King of England is God, because kings get their power from God directly. So they don't want to execute him, and they're not entirely sure that they can put him on trial. So what do you do with this really high-ranking noble that you have no idea what to do with? And so you can either exile this Charles I, which means that the civil war will just be prolonged because Charles I will keep on rebelling, or you execute him, and that will probably cause a whole host of other problems. So in the end, the court does decide to execute Charles I, and this does lead to further rebellions that Oliver Cromwell has to try and put down, eventually leading to the restoration of the Kings of England in Charles II in 1660. So it just shows that when you have, even if you capture and have a high-ranking noble who's been convicted of treason, what on earth do you do with them that's not going to cause more problems in the future? And we have so many interesting items about Charles I in the Leeds Libraries collections. I've just chosen two, which are my complete favourites. The first one on the left-hand side is from our Wing collection. And the Wing collection is a series of Civil War tracts, which are letters, pamphlets, and books from 1640 to about 1700, which covers this English Civil War period. And so these are contemporary items that describe what happened during the English Civil War. And so the item that we have here is the charge of the Commons against Charles Stewart from 1649. And this is really just a manuscript of what happened during the court case against Charles I. And you can see the indecision that the court had about what to do with him, and how they just had no idea, and how they thought that both options of exiling or execution was going to cause a whole host of problems. Which it did. And we can see those problems play out in this second book, which is from Cattermole and is called The Great Civil War in the Times of Charles and Cromwell from 1857, and it's part of our Gascoigne collection. And what Cattermole does really well is that he shows that this execution of Charles I has such an awful legacy that leads to further rebellions, further riots, and leads to further chaos in England and the rest of the England, Scotland, and Ireland. So that's the execution of Eddard Stark, and we've looked at the start of the War of the Five Kings, and now we're going to look at the last part that the Starks play in the War of the Five Kings, and it's the Red Wedding. So the Red Wedding is a massacre at the wedding of Edmure Tully and Rosalind Frey at the Twins. King in the North, Robb Stark, who is the son of Eddard Stark, his mother, Catelyn Stark, and 3,500 Northman soldiers are slaughtered at this wedding. Lord Walder Frey planned the massacre with Tywin Lannister and Roose Bolton, and you can see the collusion between the other sides that's put into play this massacre at this wedding. This is obviously a gruesome act anyway, but this gruesome act is made even worse because it breaks the laws of hospitality, which say that you should be safe if you are an invited guest into someone's house, or castle in this case, which obviously Robb Stark and the Northmen were not. And this is completely inspired by the Glencoe Massacre from 1692. So the Massacre of Glencoe took place in the Highlands of Scotland on the 13th of February 1692. Tensions were really high between the MacDonald Highland clan and the new monarchs of England and Scotland, William and Mary. And during a terrible storm, numerous Scottish soldiers arrived at Glencoe and stayed for 12 days. And then on the 12th night, the soldiers met in the dead of night. And while the MacDonald clan slept, they were systematically murdered by the guest soldiers. 30 men, women, and children of the MacDonald clan were killed by Scottish government soldiers. Now, this heinous act went against the Highland Hospitality Code, which again says that if you are a guest, everyone within your household should be safe. Any invited guest or anyone who lives in the household should be safe because of the Highlands Hospitality Code. And this led to an outcry in Scotland. And so even though the Scottish government at the time probably ordered this to happen, they had to denounce this as murder because of the outcry. And it's seen as one of the worst atrocities in British history. And you can see, obviously, the mirroring and the inspiration that led to the Red Wedding in the Game of Thrones world. And we have so many interesting books about the Glencoe Massacre in the Leeds Libraries collection, but I've just chosen these two in particular. The first one is called Massacre, The Story of Glencoe by Magnus Linklater from 1982. And what Magnus has done really interestingly is he's taken photographs of the beautiful highlands in Scotland, and he's showing that these beautiful highlands is where this awful massacre happened. And so you have this kind of really weird parallel between these beautiful pictures and then this awful story of this gruesome upon gruesome massacre that's going on in this beautiful place. And then the second book, which is The Massacre of Glencoe by John Buchan in 1933, and it really goes into detail about why the massacre was ordered in the first place. So both of these are perfect if you want to look into the Massacre of Glencoe. So we've looked at the rise and the fall of the Starks and the War of the Five Kings and how that's been inspired by historical events. And now we're going to look at a couple of landmarks in the Game of Thrones world and see how they were historically inspired. And so where else can you start but with the Wall? The Wall is a colossal fortification that stretches across the northern border of the Seven Kingdoms from coast to coast. It separates the northern border of the Seven Kingdoms from the Wildlings and the White Walkers in the wild north.
Hadrian's Wall.
And it's held by the Night's Watch. The wall is reported to be over 700 feet tall and is made of solid ice. It was constructed about 8,000 years ago, and it was created after the Long Night, which is a war between the men of the North and the White Walkers. And as we've just heard, this was completely inspired by Hadrian's Wall, which is also known as the Roman Wall or the Picts Wall. And building work started in about 122 under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, obviously the name. And this stretches 73 miles from coast to coast, and it pretty much goes through a lot of Northumberland. Hadrian's Wall was built to guard the northwest frontier of Roman Empire from the Picts in the north of the British Isle. He wanted to keep them separate because the Romans couldn't conquer the Picts, and the Picts kept on raiding in Roman territory. and it allowed the Romans to control who could enter and who could leave the Roman Empire. And once again, we just have a couple of really nice items of stock about Hadrian's Wall. And the first one is Bellum Romanum from 1753. And what I really like about this book in particular, is because it's 250 years old, it describes Hadrian's Wall in a completely different way to how we see it today. And it shows that even in the last 250 years, Hadrian's Wall has completely changed the way it looks. And then if you want to know about why the wall was so important to put up in the first place, Eric Burley's book called Research on Hadrian's Wall is an absolutely brilliant book which describes why the wall was necessary to guard the Roman Empire. And then the last thing we're going to talk about in this very short talk is Winterfell. So Winterfell is the capital of the North, and it's known as the key to the North, and it was the stronghold of House Stark. And it changes hands multiple times during the series. And at one point, it's actually destroyed as a message of subjugation to the North. Even though Winterfell, at the current stage in the book, is under opposing hands, its people are still consider themselves loyal to House Stark, and people and readers believe that this will start House Stark's a revival in the North. And I think that Winterfell is completely based on Pontific Castle. Now, Pontific Castle was the strongest castle in Yorkshire and played a key role in the English Civil War. And it was actually known as the key to the North, as was Winterfell in the Game of Thrones world. And it was besieged 3 times by the parliamentarians during the English Civil War. And it was actually taken 3 times by the parliamentarians during the English Civil War. And it kept being retaken by the royalists. So as soon as the parliamentarians took it, the royalists took it back because it was such a key part of the royalist stronghold in the north. Oliver Cromwell hated the Pontific Castle so much that after the parliamentarians took it the 3rd time, he ordered it to be pulled down. And that is why Pontific Castle is in rubble today. Because Oliver Cromwell hated having to come back up north and retake the castle over and over again, because the people of the surrounding areas were royalist loyals. Yeah. And there's one book, which is probably one of my favorite books in the entire collection. And it's about Pontific Castle, and it's called The 3 Sieges of Pontific Castle, and it's by George Fox, and it's from 1987. And this is one of my favorite books in the entirety of the Leeds Libraries collection, because it goes into detail about why Pontific Castle was so important to the royalist war effort during the English Civil War. It also has these incredible pictures about what Pontific Castle would have looked like before it was torn down by Oliver Cromwell. And that's about it, really. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of brief exercise into the inspirations behind the Game of Thrones world and how that's linked to the real life historical world. And if you have any questions, please do let me know.
That was so interesting, Josh. And I think for all of us who love Game of Thrones, it's just so interesting to see some of those real life connections, and especially the kind of local Yorkshire connections as well.
Yeah.
So see if there's any comments in the chat. But if not, is there anything else in Game of Thrones that's kind of inspired by real life events?
Yeah, so I could have gone on forever, which I don't think anyone would have wanted. But I think there was one that obviously Varys the Spider, who was the spy master, was based on Francis Walsingham, who was the spy master for Elizabeth I, who apparently knew everything that was going on in the whole of the kingdom at the time, and really kept a tab of everything for Elizabeth I, and that's exactly what the Varys the spy master is meant to do. But the only other one I couldn't quite tease this out enough, but I think personally that the Ironborn Invasion from Theon Greyjoy into the north during the War of the Five Kings has so many parallels to Harold Hardrada's invasion of Britain in 1066 that I think I could just probably do a whole talk on just that itself. So yes, I think
that part 2, Josh.
That's part 2. Yeah, don't get me started.
And so this connection between real life stories and the books and the TV series, do you think it's kind of inspired people to actually look in more detail about the history, and do you think it's kind of sparked more interest?
I think so. I think if you go to a place like Wakefield Castle, for example, there was a sign there saying that this is just like Game of Thrones. And I feel like this, and there was also a Channel 5 documentary about the War of the Roses, which was called The Real Game of Thrones, for obvious reasons that I've kind of started to allude to earlier in the talk. And so I feel like and one other example is the White Queen being developed into a TV series because of Game of Thrones' popularity. I feel like this kind of untapped potential of the War of the Roses time period, rather than anything else, has really taken the imagination because of Game of Thrones. And it shows that, you know, even if you didn't watch it or didn't like it, this idea that medieval fantasy can be interesting to a mass audience allows people to go back and look at War of the Roses and other time periods, look for, you know, similarities and all other craziness as well.
And it's great for places like us and archives, and because people don't always know that we have this kind of material in our collections and all these links that could inspire people to create their own literature, books. And that's
I kind of briefly mentioned about the Wing collection, and the best thing about the Wing collection is that during the Game of Thrones series, you realise how people just getting really annoyed that these wars are ruining crops and things like that. And the Wing collection series, which is from 1640 to 1700 in our collections, is obviously interesting because you get all the battles and get everything like that. But the main thing that I enjoy about it is when people complain about their crops getting trampled by these armies going up and down the country all the time. And that kind of human aspect is something you can only really find in our collection, which is great.
And of course, you've got all the supernatural elements. And so I think definitely if we did a part 2, we could go into all that side of it as well.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Is there also links between like the Dothraki and the Mongol Empire? And so you get quite a lot of different cultures being represented in kind of a fictional way.
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing this talk, I kind of just wanted to, it was starting to get so big that I thought I need to kind of narrow it down somehow, which is why I focus on the Starks in the War of the Five Kings, where, like say, you could focus on the Dothraki, you can focus on the Targaryens being the old kind of ancient Greeks. You know, there's so many things you can do. Yeah, I'm just starting. Watch this space. Maybe that's the way to say it.
So shall I move on to my half?
Probably for the best.
If anyone's got any questions, though, keep thinking about them and we can come back to them at the end as well. So I am looking at... So I'm starting with his Dark Materials. So this is a trilogy, which you probably all know. The first book was written in 1995, which seems so long ago now. And it's just before the huge success of the Harry Potter series. And it follows the coming of age of 2 children, Lyra and Will, as they wander through parallel universes, evading the clutches of the sinister magisterium, and encountering witches, angels, and armoured bears. And this is one of my favourite book series. And I first read it when I was probably same age as Lyra, kind of 13. And then I read it again during the first lockdown, where sadly I was probably more of the age of the villain, Mrs. Coulter's age. But I think this just shows kind of its really broad appeal. It really crosses a lot of genres, and it tackles lots of really big themes. Things about religion, freedom, authority, that we see explored in lots of different literature throughout history. And what I like is that Philip Pullman's really honest that he really does acknowledge all these different influences in his work. And 2 of the most significant were William Blake and John Milton. And in fact, the title, His Dark Materials, comes from Paradise Lost, which you can see in this section here. And His Dark Materials, well, Philip Pullman thought that linked to the dark matter, which is so central to the plot of His Dark Materials. But on a less philosophical note, much of His Dark Materials is set in the Arctic, with lots of fantastical elements such as evil research stations and talking armoured polar bears. But there's definitely a nod to real polar exploration, especially in the name of the charismatic aeronaut Lee Scoresby. And here you can see the wonderful Lin-Manuel Miranda, who plays Lee in the recent BBC adaptation. And Lee Scoresby is named after the real Arctic explorer, William Scoresby Jr. And he was a Yorkshireman born near Whitby. And his father, William Scoresby Sr., was also known for his seafaring adventures. And he joined the crew of the whaling ship Henrietta in 1785, eventually becoming captain. And in 1806, he broke the British record for sailing furthest north. And we have a copy of this wonderful facsimile. It's an 8-volume facsimile of William Scoresby Sr.'s logbook. And it has lots of maps, charts, and portraits of Scoresby Sr. and Jr. And even though this is such an important book on whaling and far northern exploration, only 300 copies were ever printed, and all but 3 of these were given to libraries. So they're very rare and they hardly ever come up on the market. So definitely worth coming in and seeing them. And William Scoresby Jr., so he followed in his father's footsteps, and his first trip to the Arctic was actually when he stowed away at age 10 on his father's ship. And I just think this is something that Lyra from his Dark Materials will probably go off and do as well. And then he was apprenticed to his father at age 13, and at 17 he was promoted to chief mate and then took over the Henrietta from his father. He then went to Edinburgh University to study sciences, but every year he came back to study the Arctic. And during these trips, he studied the Arctic seas, their climate, currents and biology. In 1820, he published his account of Arctic regions. And we have this later book from 1823. And again, it's got wonderful engravings and maps and charts. And also on a bit of a darker note, in his Dark Materials, Lee Scoresby forms a really close relationship with the armoured bear Yorick Bernison. And the real life of William Scoresby also came into contact with lots of polar bears. And in 1812, he caught a live polar bear and brought it back to his tutor at Edinburgh University, where it was kept in a pen and reportedly fed on liver and horse meat. And I think there's even a sculpture in Whitby of a polar bear. So please let us know in the chat if you've seen it, because apparently William Scoresby also brought a polar bear cub back to his hometown. And there's also another real life Arctic connection. The young hero in his Dark Materials, Will Parry, see on the left here, he also shares his name with an Arctic explorer. And this time it was completely a coincidence. And in his Dark Materials, Will goes in search of his father, John Parry, who had disappeared years earlier on an Arctic expedition. And here we've got a book written by the real William Parry. And William Parry's 1819 to 1820 expedition was perhaps one of the most successful in the long quest for the Northwest Passage. And this account of the voyage was published just a year later. And it's another gorgeous book full of lovely engravings and illustrations, maps and charts. And in 1821 and 1824, he captained the Fury. And amongst his crew was Francis Crozier, second in command to Franklin, John Franklin, on the later ill-fated expedition to find the Northwest Passage. And I won't bore Josh going on about the Franklin expedition, and I'll probably talk about it more when we do the maps talks next month. But perhaps some of you watched The Terror recently, and you saw my next author, Charles Dickens, make an appearance. And in 1854, Scottish explorer and researcher John Ray claimed that he had found evidence that Franklin's crew had resorted to cannibalism. And this was completely unthinkable at the time and really upset John Franklin's wife, Lady Jane. So she enlisted the help of her friend Charles Dickens to challenge this idea. And he wrote 3 articles in Household Words that challenged John Ray's claim. And the fact that John Ray's reputation never fully recovered, and he was actually the only explorer of this time period not to be knighted, I think can be put down in some way to Charles Dickens' enormous influence at this time. I'll move on to Charles Dickens. So Dickens features in the class and society category in the BBC novels list with Our Mutual Friends. I'm just going to talk a little bit about reading habits in the 19th century and the periodical press. So as mass literacy grew in the 19th century, lots of new material needed to be produced to cater to the new readers. And after 1850, periodicals became one of the most popular forms of publication. And you probably know, but a periodical is just something that gets printed regularly. It could be a magazine, newspaper or journal. And they were quite middle-class publications, but also more cheap, sensational publications like penny dreadfuls. And the growth of middle classes also led to the production of periodicals like Dickens's Household Words. And we're all used to box sets and streaming TV shows like Game of Thrones. But in the 19th century, if you wanted something like a really good series to get into, you'd have to sign up to a periodical. And these would give readers bite-sized chunks every month, every week. And it was probably a completely different reading experience. You'd have to have lots of cliffhangers and plot twists just to keep the readers really entertained. And I just think, just with Line of Duty and things at the moment, even with their kind of sensational storylines, it just gets everyone's grips. So I always think it's kind of a similar thing. And so we've got a wonderful collection of 19th century periodicals. I've just listed a few there. And you've probably seen rows and rows of them in libraries. And you probably think, don't look very interesting just from their spines. But I always think it's really exciting when you find out that an author's first published work has been published in one of these periodicals. And so we have periodicals like Bentley's Miscellany, which Dickens is edited, and where Oliver Twist is serialised, and Dickens's Own Household Words All Year Round, which features Great Expectations. You can see here. So that's the first bit of Great Expectations, and you can probably see the really famous first few sentences. And what I quite like as well is that the week before you get a little advert saying that next week Great Expectations will be here. And obviously Dickens's work was so popular, but this came at a really big price. So Dickens was the most plagiarised author then and since. So the Pickwick Papers in particular were an easy target for plagiarists, as the episodic plot lines and the recognisable characters made it really easy to imitate it. And the first and most famous of these pirated editions was the Penny Pickwick, which you can see on the left here. And we also have the wonderful, my favourite items, Oliver Twist. It sometimes takes people a little while to notice what's kind of wrong with this. So you've got the misspelling at the top, and then you've got edited by Boz with an S, similar to the Pickwick as well. And Dickens was Boz with a Z. And so whilst copyright law did exist, they only protected the exact writing, the exact text. So these pirated editions were really difficult to challenge. And because we have Bentley's Miscellany as well, you can compare the pirated edition on the left with the real edition on the right. So George Cruikshank, the famous illustrator, illustrated the real Oliver Twist, and you can see it's much more detailed, and the pirated edition is a much cruder woodcut. And the Penny Pickwick, so that began at the height of the Pickwick Papers' success, and Oliver Twist started in 1838, whilst Dickens's Oliver Twist was still running in Bentley's Miscellany. So who was responsible for these shameless rip-offs? Well, you have the shady Bloomsbury publisher, Edward Lloyd, and he pioneered cheap reading material for the lower classes. And I always think that he could be a character in one of Dickens's stories. And then you have the author, Thomas Becket Prest, famous for being the co-creator of the penny dreadful Sweeney Todd. So these guys had recognised this big gap in the market. They had a huge working class readership. And so instead of Dickens's shilling a month, they were selling theirs for a penny a week, so completely undercutting Dickens's work. And these would be sold on a Sunday, maybe in tobacconists, so really targeting a market of semi-literate readers outside the range of middle-class booksellers. And the content and even the crude illustrations had huge appeal, and these stories were enormously successful. And it's been claimed that they've even outsold the originals. And of course, Dickens was furious and hated this and tried to challenge it. But he lost his legal challenge because they said that the pirate editions were just so awful that no one would ever confuse the two. So they were allowed to continue. And so we have these wonderful plagiarised pirated copies. But it's great to be able to just see the two of them together. Sorry, this slide's a bit blurry, so I'll read out bits. But Dickens didn't just publish fiction in his periodicals, like we saw from the Arctic stories. We also have this wonderful account of his visit to Leeds in 1866. And this is in All the Year Round. You can come and see this and read it for yourself. And it's a rather scathing report on Leeds. So he just decided to get on the train one day and go to Leeds. And he was shocked at how horrible it was. He's seen his tall chimneys lifting their heads above a canopy of black smoke, And he was so shocked that he thought he'd actually got on the train to Manchester instead, but no, it was Leeds. And he was also very confused about the Yorkshire dialects, because he'd heard a lot of Yorkshire dialect on the stage in London, but he couldn't hear or understand anyone. And when he tried to talk in his version of Yorkshire dialect, no one understood him either. And then we've got a really nice account of going to a music hall. And he says that the young ladies in dingy evening costume, showing a lanky length of red arm, came on with pieces of music of which they could not read a note, and sang sentimental ballads in shrill notes which set your teeth on edge. So it's not the most flattering of accounts, but it gives you a really nice picture of Leeds at that time. And also in our collection, we've got Alf Matheson, a local historian, has copied out lots of accounts from different local newspapers from the time. So if you're interested, it's definitely worth coming to have a look at those. Let you read those for a second. And I'm sticking with 19th century periodicals as I go on to the theme of crime and conflict, and the most famous detective of all time, Sherlock Holmes. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of background on detective fiction. So it evolved into a best-selling genre in the 19th century, and this occurred alongside the emergence of the police force. And it's easy to assume that there's always been police, but the modern police force as we know it is quite a recent invention. And it wasn't until 1829 that we saw the first new police, and they wore all blue in contrast to the red uniforms of the military. And until 1842, the police were entirely dedicated to crime prevention, and it was only when they were very embarrassed that it took 10 days to find a murderer that they realised they actually needed detectives as well. So the government opened an 8-man detective department, and this was based on Scotland Yard. And this became shorthand for the detective department. And it was later renamed the Criminal Investigation Department. And interestingly, Leeds Central Library was also home to the CID. That was in the 1930s to 1960s, I think. So these signs are still in Leeds Central Library, so please keep an eye out for them when you come and visit us when we're back open properly. And the first detective stories are said to have been written by Edgar Allan Poe in America, but Dickens can lay claim to the first fictional detective in his novel Bleak House, where he's got Mr. Bucket, and he's said to have been inspired by the real-life detective Charles Field. And as a profession, private detectives grew significantly, partly due to the 1857 Divorce Act. And this also provided a new profession for women, because it was seen that women could be easier to infiltrate and gather evidence. So you even see lots of female detectives at this time. Female detectives also appear in literature. Unfortunately, these aren't in our collections. They're very rare. So I think I've got these from the British Library. But it's amazing to think that these appear in literature much before. I don't think you get the first female police officers with powers of arrest until around 1915. So that's just a bit of the social context behind Sherlock Holmes. And so he obviously flourished during this time, but he didn't get off to a great start. Conan Doyle wrote the first Sherlock story, A Study in Scarlet, in 1886. This was almost completely ignored, as was the second one. But when Conan Doyle wrote 2 further stories in the Strand magazine, these were an enormous success. So we've got quite a good collection of the Strand magazine, and the first going up to about 1903 to 1905, I think. And editions that featured Sherlock Holmes were eagerly snapped up by readers, and you'd have queues forming outside newsstands and magazine offices, and they sell out really quickly. And then Sidney Paget, so you can see his initials just in the corner of the illustration. He's responsible for creating the image of Holmes that we all know. So the deerstalker hats and the cape, they were all his invention. They don't feature in Conan Doyle's text. And the depiction of Sherlock Holmes in the Strand, that really has had a major influence on all other kind of detective stories in fiction and television since. But the popularity of Sherlock Holmes was a real problem for Conan Doyle, as although he was so popular and made him very wealthy, his heart was never really into detective fiction, and he grew to despise the character that he had invented. The pressure from readers to come up with more and more elaborate stories must have been immense. especially as he would have preferred to focus on what he saw as more serious work, like historical fiction. So in 1893, we have one of the most famous literary events. Sherlock Holmes was killed off during a fight to the death with Moriarty. Fans were devastated, and young men in London actually wore black armbands in mourning. And it was a huge blow for the Strand, who instantly lost 20,000 subscribers. But then Conan Doyle was then free to focus on historical fiction, completing a number of novels and plays in the coming year. And detective fiction remained really popular. You can see that in Punch, they make fun of it. They say, take 1 part of Gaborio and 50 parts water, add a lady of title, a comic official from Scotland Yard, and a diamond bracelet. Strain the mixture into 12 equal parts and serve up in a magazine. And so this idea of detective fiction as being kind of formulaic and lowbrow is something that the genre really had trouble shaking off. So you can see why Conan Doyle wanted to try something that he thought was more highbrow and respectable. But Sherlock Holmes would not stay dead, of course. Arthur Conan Doyle publishes The Hound of the Baskervilles in the Strand in 1901, which resulted in 30,000 new subscribers nearly overnight. And the reception plus public pressure caused Conan Doyle to resurrect Holmes in 1903 with the explanation that he'd faked his own death. And so you see here in the Strand magazine, the return of Sherlock. And of course, Sherlock Holmes continued to have a very busy afterlife. If Dickens was the most plagiarised author, Sherlock Holmes must be the most adapted, with numerous films, TV shows, and games, of course. And then just to finish on a very local note, Conan Doyle increasingly became interested in spiritualism and supernatural, and he was famously taken in by the costly fairy hoax. Conan Doyle published an article and photographs in the Strand magazine, and that was in 1922, so unfortunately our run doesn't go that far. But we do have his 1922 book, The Coming of the Fairies, which expanded on this article. And without Conan Doyle, no one would have heard about these pictures at all. And the debate about their authenticity went right up to 1983 until Elsie Wright admitted they had been faked. And it's just one of those really intriguing, fascinating stories. I think just shows that sometimes the real life of authors and writers can be even stranger than the books that they wrote. And so I hope that these examples have shown you kind of some things that you might not have thought we had in Central Library, and have inspired you to maybe look at some of the BBC novels again. I know me and Josh have really enjoyed sharing with you some of our favourite books. So if anyone's got any questions, please ask them.
Yeah, that was really great, Rhian. I'm going to jump in first. I'm going to say my question. So, how did the Strand react to the loss of Sherlock Holmes? That just seems like a ridiculous thing.
Well, because Sherlock Holmes was so popular, they didn't have much trouble trying to find people to replace them. So there'd been people kind of waiting in the wings, really. So we have the first replacement was by Arthur Morrison, and he created an investigator called Martin Hewitt, and he was almost like the complete opposite to Holmes. So he was a bit more lower class, he was grittier and realistic, rather than Holmes, who was kind of much more kind of a heroic, mystical figure. But then interesting, we have an author called L.T. Mead, and that was a pseudonym for Elizabeth Thomasina Mead Smith. And she wrote stories in the Strand, but what was interesting is that she created this evil female mastermind, so almost like a female equivalent of Moriarty. So you really do get these lots of different examples, lots of different writers building on the success of Sherlock Holmes.
Actually, my next question goes into what Rebecca's just said in the chat, where she said that she's never heard of the Dickens knockoffs before, but how did we get to have them in the Central Library? Seems like it's an odd thing to have.
I don't know how they were saved originally, because what's interesting about those kind of materials is that they were so ephemeral that people would just pick them up. They were so cheap that a lot of them don't survive. They might have been left in pubs or shared with friends. But those two items in particular are part of our Henry collection, which is a collection of Sweepiana, which is definitely one of our stranger collections. So it was a collection that was built up by Sidney Henry and was donated to the museums in the 50s. And he was just obsessed with anything to do with chimney sweeps. So there must be in both of those Charles Dickens rip-offs some sort of mention or a picture or something of chimney sweeps. And that's why they're in that collection. So, I mean, in that collection, you've got all sorts of things like Hans Christian Andersen, William Blake. It really is a wonderful, weird and wonderful collection for people to come and have a look at.
Yeah, they really must. And then my last question, which I've just come up with, is what were the literacy rates like in 19th century? Was it good or bad, or was it how much did it improve?
What was interesting is that there's a huge shift between 1800 and 1900. So in 1800, you have about 40% of men, 60% of women illiterates. By the 1900s, that's dropped all the way down to 3%. And that's to do a lot to do with schooling. You get compulsory education during that time. You can imagine there's now a huge new market of readers. And that's where you get all this kind of really interesting material published and things like the penny dreadfuls and the kind of sensational literature.
Yeah, we all love penny dreadfuls. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Rhian. I think everyone's just saying really nice things in the comment section. So yeah, nothing bad, don't worry. But if anyone does have any questions, then make sure you put it in there, and I'll read it out for Rhian or me, you know. Only nice ones though. We've got one from Patrick, which says, who was the author who wrote all the Sherlock Holmes books, and how many did the author who wrote them, how many Sherlock Holmes books are there?
Oh gosh, so it's Arthur Conan Doyle is the author, and I don't know how many in total. If you think about all the stories that you'd have to write to go into the periodicals, it's an awful lot of stories. And then obviously there was a bit of a break where he stopped writing them and then he started again. It's definitely something I can look up. I'm sure there's a lot. And of course, they've been adapted and new stories, and there's been a BBC adaptation of them as well. It's, yeah, keeps on going.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Yeah, so if anyone's got any last questions, then please put it in the chat. And if not, then we hope you've enjoyed the talk.
Yeah, and I suppose it's just to kind of promote. I've got some links up there to look at our library blog, to look at Leodis, where some of the pictures are from. And this is, just remind everyone, this is part of our Novels That Shaped Our World programme in partnership with BBC Arts Council England and Libraries Connected. We've got lots more events coming up over the weekend, including our Library Games Jam, where we're asking people to create games inspired by one of the novels on this list. So please have a look if you think that's something that you're interested in.
We do have one final question from Sally, which I'm going to read. Rhian, your connection to Line of Duty that she mentioned, what is the connection?
I just think that we don't have it so much anymore, but that kind of collective thing where everyone's desperate to know what's going to happen next week, and you're thinking, oh, what's the next plot going to be? And I think even though something like Line of Duty, you think that's so outrageous, that plot line, that's exactly what they would do in these periodicals. You need to have a cliffhanger, all these twists just to get people back the next week. So yeah, it's the kind of the modern equivalent, I think. And I think Game of Thrones was exactly the same when that was on TV. And it's not something we get so much. But yeah. Yeah.
Even the Marvel comic book films as well, you know, you can tell that they're based off of the comics, which lead to a cliffhanger every other issue, to keep people buying more and more. So yeah, really great example.
Brilliant. I think it was just I was going to ask you, Josh, about, do you think people enjoy the books or the TV series more knowing the real history? Do you think us giving this context adds more enjoyment? Or maybe someone could answer in the comments, I don't know.
Well, I know so please answer in the comments if you have one. I know for me, I adore the War of the Roses to no end. And so I find it really tricky to read things like Philippa Gregory. And it's not a knock on Philippa Gregory one little bit. Don't take from this talk that Josh hates Philippa Gregory. But I find it really tricky because I enjoy the actual history, and then kind of see things not play out in the way that I'd imagined it to have played out. must be, I find for reading her really tricky, but I do find the Game of Thrones books really interesting to see how people have taken such an event and then kind of changed it into such a fantasy world. And I think people do kind of, if something twigs and you think, oh, that's very much like Pontific Castle, or that's like the Glencoe Massacre, but just in this completely different twist. I think it does heighten the enjoyment, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Rebecca's saying, have we seen the Game of Thrones recipe book? I have not, but I will look it up. That sounds incredible.
Want to add to the collection.
Yeah, the talk was worth it just for that.
Yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you all so much for coming. It's lovely to see so many of you. And I think what we would just like to say at the end, that even though we love doing these online events and showing people items, we'd love to have you back in the library and showing you all the books in real life. So I hope that we'll be able to do that very soon. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thanks everyone.